Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Whale Sanctuary Project's webinar series. I hope everyone can hear me and see me, and my guest, Dr. Mark Uhen, and I want to welcome everyone to the webinar. Today, we're going to do something really interesting and fun. So we're going to talk about cetacean evolution, and I have with me one of the world's foremost experts on early cetacean evolution, good friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Uhen. I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Uhen. He is now the chair of the Department of Atmospheric, Oceanic, and Earth Sciences at George Mason University. He is a paleontologist and a whale fossil expert. So if you've never met a whale fossil hunter, you're about to meet one today. Now, Mark focuses on early whales called archeocetes, ancient whales, and he has done fieldwork in Peru, in the Sahara, and of course, right here in the US. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, Mark and I worked on a major study of fossil whales to chart the evolution of brain and body size in toothed whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And I will tell you about that work a little bit later. But for now, welcome, Mark. Welcome, everybody else. And what we're going to do is Mark is going to give a presentation on PowerPoint, share his screen. I will give a short presentation, and then we will turn things to the Q&A. And please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's get started on this journey, because it is a really fun and exciting journey to think about the evolution of dolphins and whales. So let's turn things over to Mark, and we will get started.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Lori. Like Lori said, we've known each other for years, and I always remember our work together fondly, and it's still going on. We're still working on using some of the same data and new data to explore new questions about brain size and body size evolution. So let me, let me share my screen here and see if I get the right, I have like 6 windows open, so let me see if I get the right one. There we go. And let me make this the right size. Okay, so does everyone see that? Does it look like a slide to you?
Yeah.
Okay, so I study, indeed, archeocetes, as Lori said. The ancient whales are my first love, and where I do a lot of my work still, and I'm going to focus on those today. But I and the students in my lab have really started working on more modern whales too, and the origins of modern whales from these groups. So because I only have like 20 minutes or so, I'm going to focus on that early group and get you right up to the point where modern whales originate from this group. So, but we certainly can talk about those two in the future. So let's just get started. So as you know, whales are one of the most unusual orders of modern mammals, being fully aquatic, and they span a huge range of body size, as you can see in this slide. And they include the largest animal ever to have lived, the blue whale. But a lot of things are small, like little porpoises and dolphins too. So both the biggest and the biggest range of body size of any order of mammals that we know. And the modern whales we call Neoceti, the new whales. And this includes 2 modern suborders, the mysticetes, which are the big baleen whales that filter feed using baleen. And they're much less diverse than the modern odontocetes, which are the toothed whales. That includes orca that you see here, Orcinus orca, sperm whales, dolphins and porpoises, beaked whales, all kinds of stuff. And their main feature is that they use echolocation to find their prey, but they eat one individual prey item at a time, and they don't chew their food. They just swallow it whole, which will become relevant in just a few minutes here. So those are the 2 modern groups, and we're going to not focus on those today, but rather this earlier group, the archeocetes, which encompass the transition from living on land to being fully aquatic. There's several different families here. I'll touch on most, but not all of them, because again, I could talk for days about them. And we know lots more about them than we used to. I'm working on a grant proposal right now, and I did this funny calculation where I found out that more than 50% of the known fossil whales that we know today have been described since the year 2000, which is amazing. Like, hundreds of years up to that point, and then in the last 20 or so, we've described that many and more. So this group in particular has received a lot of attention since the 90s, and we'll look at some of the neat things about them today. So if there's one thing you're going to remember from the things I'm going to say today, it's this: that whales are part of this group called the Artiodactyla. And that's a big sciencey name for a group you know and love, which are the even-toed ungulates or hoofed mammals. So things like cows and deer, giraffes, sheep, and hippos. In fact, we think hippos are the closest living relatives of modern whales. And this was first shown by really early anatomists. Another idea was supported by early genetic studies, and it's been reconfirmed again with genetic studies. And many of these fossils that we found since the 90s have really built up the evidence for this. And in fact, you can see down in the lower, can you see my screen? Can you see my arrow here, my cursor? Yeah. Okay, so this little bone down here is called the astragalus. And it's a bone in the ankle. And artiodactyls have this very particular shape where there's sort of a pulley on the proximal end and a pulley on the distal end. And only artiodactyls have this. And while modern whales don't really have hind limbs, some of these early fossil ones do, and they have an astragalus. And guess what? It looks just like this one, just like it. And so for that reason and others, we classify whales as part of the artiodactyl group. So here is some of the fossil evidence of that. There's a group of artiodactyls called the Rauwelidae. They live in southern Asia during the Eocene, which is right when whales originate. And what we can see in them is a rather typical looking terrestrial artiodactyl fossil shown here in this picture of Indohyus, both as a skeleton and walking around underwater. And what's unusual about it is that even though they have very typical artiodactyl teeth and ankles, their bones are very dense, and they have these very dense ear bones called, labeled here, the tympanic bulla. And a very dense, large tympanic bulla is a feature of whales. And so even though the rest of the animal looks like a terrestrial artiodactyl, it's got this whale ear and dense bones suggesting, and that ear actually helps them hear underwater. And increased bone density is, again, a feature of things that go into water, which is why we think these Rauwelids were doing something in the water. There's lots of ideas: escaping predators, cooling off, maybe looking for prey. You might think, well, artiodactyls, everything you just mentioned, are herbivores, right? But think more pig diet. Pigs will eat almost anything. Pigs are omnivorous. And we think Rauwelids probably had an omnivorous diet that shifted more towards aquatic prey as they became more aquatic and turned into whales. Another bit of evidence came from this animal called Rhodocetus. This is the foot, and you can see right here is the astragalus. And again, it's got that artiodactyl shape, which really helped confirm that whales indeed are artiodactyls. Okay, and again, the living sister taxon, or the group that's most closely related to whales that's still alive today, are the hippos. And that is mostly coming from genetic evidence, but the evidence from fossils and anatomy don't argue with that, but the genetic evidence is really what's primarily driving that. Okay, so I said that Rauwelids lived in the Eocene, and that's actually when when whales first originated as well, and the world was kind of a different place then. And you can see the continents are a little more spread out, and India has been moving north, and this is right when it's starting sort of to kiss Asia. It's just beginning to make contact with Asia. But notice there's also no ice at the poles. So that means there's a lot more water in the oceans and sea levels are high. So a lot of these edges of continents are flooded. And it's in this area in Indo-Pakistan that we find the evidence of the earliest whales. And the earliest ones are in this family called Pakicetidae, after Pakicetus, which means Pakistan whale, because that's where it was found. And they are both terrestrial and aquatic, and they're posed here walking and swimming. And we think it could do both very effectively. So it's probably moving in and out of the water. And the earliest fossils of them are found in estuaries, so the ends of rivers. So they're probably in fresher water than we'd think of most cetaceans today. And here's some of the bones. This is the original fossil on the left. It's a little piece of skull, and it's got that cetacean tympanic bulla. So it's definitely a whale based on that. But its teeth are pretty different from those of the raw whalids. They're less grinding teeth and more what we call sectorial or slicing teeth. And so this animal is probably more of a meat eater and probably not eating as much plant material, if any at all. A couple million years later in the same area, we have something called Ambulocetus. Its full name is Ambulocetus natans, the walking swimming whale. And it basically says what we think about it. It was sort of, it was bigger than Pakicetus. Pakicetus is pretty little, and this animal had really robust teeth. It's shown here eating a poor little artiodactyl cousin. We don't know if it ate terrestrial prey. It probably ate more aquatic prey, but I like this reconstruction of it. So it too is from the Eocene of Indo-Pakistan, and it's well represented by a virtually complete skeleton. There it is, skeleton. And this picture got a little distorted, I'm sorry, but this is the pelvis. And the pelvis is up here in the skeleton. Here it is called out. You can see it has a really robust, what we call acetabulum. That's the socket for a ball and socket joint where the hind limb would attach, and really big surfaces for muscle attachment. So it had a very robust hind limb. So it could use those legs both for swimming and for walking on land. A few million years later, also in Indo-Pakistan, we have this animal Rhodocetus. We have really good partial skeletons and almost complete skeletons of this animal. And it has robust hind legs, could clearly come out on land, could clearly swim in the water, but they're smaller than those in Ambulocetus. So they're starting to reduce. So they're not quite as big and not quite as robust. I think a good modern analog for these are sea lions. So spending much, if not most of their time in the water, coming out on land to breed and have their young. And I don't have a slide of this, I don't think, or maybe I do. Hold on, let me peek ahead. I don't, I'm sorry, I didn't include a slide. There's a related animal called Myocetus that we have a whole skeleton of. And it was a female, because, and we know that because it had a near-term fetus in it. And the reason we think they bred and have their young on land is because in modern artiodactyls, if you think about nature documentaries from Africa, right? The gazelle is out there, when the baby comes out, it comes out head first. And they can walk and hop around really quickly. But if whales did that, their babies would probably drown, because if there's any pause during birth, the baby might try to take a breath and die. So baby whales come out tail first. So the last thing to come out is their head, and then mom immediately pushes them up to the surface. And so when whales become fully aquatic, we think it'd be advantageous for them to flip around and have their baby's tail first. Well, this very near-term fetus in this fossil whale was positioned to be born head first, like artiodactyls do on land. So it suggests that was happening on land. It's not definitive, but it's evidence, and it's the best evidence we got. So there you go. Here's some more Rhodocetus. Here's the skull, the lower jaw. Here's the nares, the hole for the nose. In modern whales, it's way up on top of the head. In terrestrial things, it's on the tip of the snout. So you can see it's part way up the snout. You can also see this is the inside of the lower jaw. So we're looking from inside out. And you can see there's a really big hole here. In most mammals, there's a tiny hole for blood vessels and nerves that come down to the teeth. In whales, it's really big. And in most whales, there's a big fat pad that sits there that touches the ear. And in fact, sound is thought to come in the jaw and get funneled to the ear that way in modern whales. And we can see that in this pretty early whale here. And here, again, is the pelvis and femur. And it's significantly smaller than we see in Ambulocetus, but still plenty robust to move it around on land.
Mark,
Yes,
can you point out the brain case in Rhodocetus?
I
I'd
sure
like
can.
to see that.
It is back here,
Right.
right? So it's really well separated from the eyes. In modern whales, that becomes much more globose, round, and fills up this space. But in this space between where the eyes are and the brain cases, there's big muscles in these guys that attach down here in the lower jaw and helps them pull their jaw up. Because, I'm glad you brought this up, they're still chewing their food, right? They're still using these robust teeth to chew up their food, just like most mammals do. And we'll talk more about that. There's the astragalus, just like in an artiodactyl. So again, more evidence of their artiodactyl ancestry. And we have these bones in this one specimen articulated, right? They're in their anatomical positions, which is really nice. So we know how they all fit together without having to guess. Again, a couple million years later, whales have now gotten out of Indo-Pakistan and spread around the world. This animal is called Georgiacetus because it's from Georgia here in the US. And this is a paper I wrote where they have a really big hind limb. Let me show you that. There it is. This is the pelvis, big acetabulum. But they weren't connected to the vertebral column. We can tell there was no connection there, which is weird. It's like, how could you use them to walk if they're not attached to your vertebral column? Well, we think they didn't, but they still use them for swimming by putting them out behind them like this and moving their vertebral column up and down in the water, which is exactly how whales swim today, but without legs, right? They move their tail, they expand the tail with soft tissue, and then they can get rid of their legs and use only their tail to swim. So this last group I'm showing you is called the Basilosauridae. I'm showing you an animal called Dorodon, which I wrote my doctoral dissertation on many, many years ago. And this is the group that is the first group to be fully aquatic. We think they did not come out on land for several reasons. So one, those are the hind limbs back here. Here's the reconstruction. Here's this little tiny limb. Again, not at all connected to the vertebral column. And so no hind limbs, no walking. They also have many more vertebrae than in earlier whales. They get earlier whales have 6 lumbar vertebrae. These guys have 20, which is a feature of modern whales. And what they do is muscles originate on these more anterior or towards the front vertebrae that insert on more posterior vertebrae, and that's what really drives the tail up and down. And we think these guys had tail flukes, these soft tissue structures in the back, and I'll show you why. We actually have a bony evidence of their presence. And also their forelimbs are much more flipper-like. Whales don't move at the elbow at all today. These guys have very restricted motion at the elbow, down to like 30 degrees, so very little motion. And so they're partial flippers, but they certainly couldn't do a push-up with those forelimbs. They're just not, they would not function in that way. Here's the skull, and from dorsal, from top down, you can see the nares is moving further back up the skull. Here's the skull with the teeth in the palate. There's that big dense bulla that indicates hearing underwater. There's other features that say they can hear better underwater than earlier whales. And these teeth, when you look at them from top down, you can see they're just becoming these thin blades. And we think they just used them to slice up their prey. And we know they did that because we can look at the wear on the teeth and see that they were actually using them to chew their food. And you can see the teeth here in side view. And another feature of this group is that they not only have these triangles, but they have these little denticles, these little bumps on them, which we think help grip the food when they're chewing it, so it doesn't slip out of their mouth. And modern whales, like Odontocetes, the toothed whales that still eat individual prey items, don't chew their food at all. They just get it in their mouth and swallow it whole. These guys were eating prey that was larger, slicing it into pieces and then swallowing those pieces. All right, and we know a lot about Dorodon. We've got dozens and dozens of specimens, even babies. So this is a piece of maxilla, this bone right here. And these are the teeth erupting. So as you know, being a mammal yourself, you know that mammals have two sets of teeth. They have a baby set or deciduous teeth, and then an adult set of teeth. And what this is showing you is these teeth, this one, and this one are baby teeth. They're the deciduous or milk teeth, premaxillary or premolars. And this one coming up, it's actually just starting to come up out of the bone, is the first molar. And this is actually the first premolar, but it's the baby tooth version. So this one and this one are just starting to erupt. And we can work out the sequence of tooth eruption and tell you that these animals grew up very slowly, which is another feature of modern whales, that they mature very slowly. That's often a feature of things that are highly encephalized, things that have large brains because they have a lot of learning to do as a juvenile. And so again, we see that already in this first fully aquatic group of basalsaurid archeocetes. Their hearing is very well characterized by looking at the teeny bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes, and this structure inside another bone called the cochlea. That's where sound energy is turned into nerve impulses. And by looking at the detailed anatomy here, we can tell you that they could not hear high frequency sounds like modern toothed whales. So they couldn't echolocate, and they heard more like modern baleen whales. They have the same frequency range as modern baleen whales, which means that was a feature that evolved later in toothed whales. And I said we had evidence of tail flukes. Here it is. This is the vertebral column of Stenella, a spinner or spotted dolphin. And you can see the vertebrae, these are the last vertebrae in the tail. They get narrower and narrower and narrower. And all of a sudden, the vertebrae get very flat and they're wider, right? And it's right here that those soft tissue flukes insert onto these bones, onto the vertebral column. And we see a similar, not identical, but similar pattern in Dorodon. They get narrow, 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 and all of a sudden they go boop, and they get just a little longer. And so they think it looks a little smaller than Stenella, but it does look like they had tail flukes. So what you can't see is that in the dorsoventral direction, up, down, it's very flat. The vertebrae are flat, and that's true here and also in Dorodon. So pretty clear evidence of flukes in these fully aquatic archeocetes like Dorodon. Here's the forelimb. Modern whales have a very broad fan-shaped shoulder blade or scapula. In other mammals, it's kind of just oval, and these guys have it. And it's because all the muscles in modern whales that move the forelimb or flipper attach to the scapula. And we see that here. Here's the elbow, not quite locked, but it's got very restricted range of motion. Here's the wrist, and there's only passive motion at the wrist. They couldn't flex and extend it much with muscles. So semi-flipper, let's call it. Here's what's left of the pelvis in a related animal called Chrysocetus. We don't have it from Dorodon, but this is a close relative. It's tiny. It's like this big on a 5-meter animal. So very, very small. This is Dorodon. That's a proximal femur. That's the close end of the thigh bone. That's a kneecap in the middle, a little tiny kneecap. And this little crumb is what's left of the astragalus. So not a lot to see there, but it's still there. It's just not, it's so small, it's almost, it's hard to see what it looked like. How's that? And just to sum up here, this pink region is what we've talked about. So pachycetids, very terrestrial animals that were in the water. We get successively more aquatic. I did not talk about this group called the Remingtonicidae, kind of mammal crocodile-like things, but they're kind of a side branch. They're not really like in the middle. Protocetids are the group where the transition where the legs decouple from the vertebral column happens, and the vertebral column becomes simplified. And then by the time we get to basalsaurids, we're fully aquatic, tiny legs, lots of vertebrae, and definitely having tail flukes. So it's from this group that we think we can derive the modern Neoceti, the Mysticeti over here, when they started to filter feed. and odontocetes over here where they started to echolocate. And so these are other stories I could tell you. I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop there, and maybe I can tell those stories another time. So, but if you have questions about them, I'm happy to answer them. And so I'll stop there and turn it back over to Lori.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was brilliant. And just I could listen to you forever. I hope everyone enjoyed that. I already see we have tons of questions, and that's great. So I think what I'll do is I have a little presentation about the work Mark and I did in the 90s and early mid 2000s that has to do with brain evolution in the animals that he's been talking about. And then how did cetaceans get so brainy after all? And you know, why are we so concerned about what their lives are like in tanks? When you know what kind of brain they have and you know their evolution, you know where they're supposed to live, and it's not in a tank. So I'm going to share my screen just for a few minutes, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time with all of your great questions. Thank you, Mark. Okay. So I'm going to go all the way back here. Can you see that? All right. So as I said, I had the privilege of working with Mark and a number of other colleagues, mainly at the Smithsonian Institution in DC. And it was just, I don't think I had more fun ever in my life than working there. It was just hands down wonderful. And I was interested in finding out how you get a brain like this. This is the brain of an orca. And where did this brain come from? So I was very, very interested, and still am, in the fact that these animals have the largest brain to body size next to modern humans. So what was the pattern change in their brain and body size that led to this status? And when did their brains get large? That was one of the things that we and our colleagues were trying to figure out, is just when did they become so brainy? So we spent a lot of time at various museums, but as I said, mainly the Smithsonian Institute, and down in the paleo basement, where there's drawers and drawers and drawers of fossils, and you just pull these drawers out and there's fossil crania. And we were able to do something very special. And Mark talked about the fact that it was in the 90s that all of this kind of work took off. Part of the reason for that was the fact that we have the advent of new technologies that allowed to probe these fossils. This is computed tomography, which allows you to look inside a fossil. So if you look on the left, there's a fossil archeocetes, is the brain case, and we put 66 of these guys in the scanner up on the third floor of the Museum of Natural History. And we were able to get pictures that look like what you see on the right. This is a computed tomography section, a cross section through a specimen where you see the outer bone of the skull. This is the cradle. And then inside, you see the internal cavity of the cranium, which is called the endocranium. And all of that stuff is really just filled in. It used to be where the brain was, but if we measure it and we look at the morphology, we can tell something about the brain from looking at this endocranial cavity. So we did that for 66 different fossils. And we were able to also look at body size and use both brain size estimates and body size estimates to come up with something called an encephalization quotient, which is simply, for our purposes today, a measure of brain size relative to body size. And this is what we found. So if you look here, this is millions of years going back about 50 million years to the present. And on this axis is EQ. And if you have an EQ of 1, you have a pretty average brain size. Less than 1, you have a smaller than average brain. More than 1, you have a larger than average brain. And what we were able to see is that the archeocetes that Mark talked about all had pretty small brains for their body size, and they didn't have a big globular brain that we know of today. And then about 33 million years ago, there was a shift in encephalization. And so some of the early modern forms started to come in through this period, and they had smaller bodies, larger brains, and the brain started to, the cerebrum of the brain looked like it was starting to become more developed. And there was a second significant increase a little bit later. But since I'd say the mid-Miocene, and Mark can correct me on this if there's newer information, we can say that modern cetaceans, modern odontocetes, toothed whales, have had the same brain size, the same encephalization level. But you can see that where all the action is right here, the shift from archeocetes going extinct and the new Neoceti coming in with bigger brains and higher encephalization levels. And so the picture looks like this. Around 33 million years ago, there was some kind of a shift in the evolution of cetaceans, and they went from being like this to beings like this, with the highest encephalization levels next to modern humans, brains 3, 4, 5 times the size you'd expect for their body size, highly intelligent and very socially complex. And in fact, compared to humans, they are the most encephalized organisms on the planet. And this just shows you EQ from 1 to 7. Brains, modern humans have brains that are about 7 times the size you'd expect, so our EQ is about 7. Our closest relatives, the great apes, have larger brains than you'd expect, in the 2.5 to 3 range. But there are a number of dolphin species who have brains 3, 4, 5 times the size you would expect for their body size. They're significantly more encephalized than even our closest relatives. And so that is sort of a whirlwind tour of what we found when we were doing our work in the 90s with all those fossils. And it was really the first time that anyone had really taken data that couldn't be accessed before computed tomography and get that data and then map it, chart it, to get a timeline to answer the question of how, maybe not how, but when cetaceans became so brainy. So I'm going to stop there, and we can go to questions that we have. Gosh, we have so many. Let's see. Let's start with Lena's question. She says, I noticed that most of the predators among the whales are significantly smaller than baleen whales, with the exception of the sperm whale, of course. What advantages does that bring? Are they more agile?
Yeah, so as I said, odontocetes, the predator, they're all predators. So you got to remember that. Even baleen whales are predators, just prey on very small things. They have to swallow their food whole. So they has to be small enough to go down. And so there's also an energetic argument. When you can eat really small things like krill or copepods, which baleen whales do, but only if you eat them in bulk. And that is way more energy efficient when you're much larger, right? If you're doing it the size of an orca, it's not going to work out for you. You won't, the energy budget won't, there won't be enough energy in what you're doing. So you have to expend a lot of energy to eat bulk prey. The energy efficiency equation is much more favorable to you at larger body size. So we think that's why baleen whales are so big and why most toothed whales aren't so big, because they're going after one prey at a time. And so the energy budget favors smaller things. They're still good size. Like compared to other mammals, what even the smallest dolphin is bigger than your average mammal. Right. So, don't discount little porpoises this big. They're still big mammals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do modern dolphins use their pelvis at all in reproduction for mating?
Sure. So most odontocetes still have a little stick of bone on each side, which is the remnant of the pelvis. And some, pelvic floor muscles stuff is attached to it. I don't think it would be there if it didn't have some kind of function, but it's really pretty minor. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we know that early on there were bones that resembled a human hand? And the question here is about, just what did that look like? And did they have articulating fingers at one point, or
Sure.
were they, yeah.
I mean, all mammals start out with a five-digit
Mm-hmm.
manus or hand, right? So I don't think it looked like a human hand. It still does. It's still got the same bones, basically. What they do is they take the bones of the wrist and make them not. I mean, they articulate, but there's no movement between them. And then they take these parts. The bones in here are called your phalanges, and they make more of them, so that they get longer by multiplying the number of phalanges. So basilosaurid archeocetes, as far as we know, kept the same number of digits and phalanges, and it's when they make that transition to the modern whales that they start multiplying the phalanges and making the flippers longer. Archeocetes probably had them all encased in a flipper, but the evidence for that encasement is hard to come by. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's hard to be sure when that happened, but I would say probably when they became fully aquatic.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And you
Yep.
point out something that's sort of a general principle of evolution, which is that things change, morphology changes a lot of times, not always, a lot of times by just making more of the same repeating
Yep.
units or removing units. So
Yeah, evolution
works that
yeah,
way.
it works with what you got to start with, right?
Yeah.
You rarely get like new bones. It happens, just rarely. Yep.
Yep. Yep. And cetaceans are a great example of that. Great example of that. Do you know anything about, this is another one from Lena. Do you know anything about the development of baleen? Why did it develop? And
Sure.
anything about the keratin that it's made of?
No, this is an area of active research in my lab, and I will say active scientific debate.
Mhm.
We are debating with colleagues of ours. So baleen, as you mentioned, is made of keratin, the same stuff your fingernails are made out of, and you know what that's like. And baleen is really like that. It's tough and flexible, sort of a polymer, biopolymer, if you will. And interestingly, some artiodactyls lose their upper teeth and they get a keratinous pad on the roof of their mouth. And some odontocetes, like porpoises, have this little keratinous band around their teeth. So keratin in the mouth in this group is common. I don't know how to, I mean, they're obviously independently evolved, but it's not uncommon to find keratin in the mouth. My group hypothesizes that we used to think tooth loss was indicative of the presence of baleen. And so in the evolution of baleen whales, their teeth, you see, we have things we call baleen whales with big teeth, some with little teeth, and then some with no teeth. And we used to say, well, no teeth means they got baleen. We've hypothesized that there's a transitional feeding mode where they're suction feeding, where they suck prey into their mouth that perhaps they swallow whole because they don't have teeth. And only later did baleen evolve. And our colleagues think there was a phase when they had teeth and baleen at the same time. That seems kind of implausible to us, but the truth is, we would assert, our team would assert, there's no bony indicator of the presence or absence of baleen. So that makes it really hard when all you have is bones. Now, I will say we do have fossilized baleen. It's rare, but you can get it in exquisite preservation, but it only goes back to the middle Miocene, like 14, 15 million years ago. So this time when it's developing, we don't have fossils that preserve baleen now. That could be because they didn't have it. It could be because it's just not preserved yet. So active area research, so watch for that.
Well, on that score, do we have any fossils that indicate that there was suction feeding? Like, didn't Otobinocetops do suction feeding?
Sure, yes. I mean, we see suction feeding in a lot of modern toothed whales. And Otobinocetops, as Lori mentioned, is this thing called the walrus whale. Look it up. Bizarre. You won't think it's a whale. And even modern gray whales do some sort of suction feeding. They kind of ram their heads down into the bottom of the ocean and suck in water, sediment, and the benthos, the stuff that lives in the bottom. And then they expel the water and sediment and eat what was in the bottom. It's a very unusual feeding mode, but at least we know that one group of modern baleen whales does this odd thing that includes some suction. And the thing you got to remember about mammals is every mammal knows how to suck because we all do it when we're babies, right? We suction feed on mom's milk. And so, suction feeding is quite common in lots of aquatic vertebrates. So I think it's at least a plausible idea. We have a whale called Maya bellina that we said was the earliest mysticete that lacked teeth, and we asserted that it is a suction feeder. Yep.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, hi Robert. Robert has a question about ruminant stomachs. And do you know anything? I mean, that's the other end of the animal that I work on.
Yeah.
But do we know anything about that throughout their evolution?
Yes and no, because obviously we paleontologists work on bones and teeth. So no, from our perspective, but one of the earliest indicators that whales might be artiodactyls is the fact that, like other artiodactyls, they have this complex multi-chambered stomach. And early anatomists were like, hey, maybe we got something here. And at first people kind of poo-pooed it. It's like, whales, artiodactyls, like seriously? But it turns out they're probably right. That it very well could be that they've inherited these multi-chambered stomachs from a common ancestor.
Right. Now we come to some $6 million questions here from some folks. The first one is the big one, which is, why do you think these early cetaceans went back into the water?
Always get this question, and the why question is really hard to answer. So I'll give you what we know, which is that it looks like they went back into the water. I said the first thing to change was their bone density and ears. The second thing is their feeding apparatus. So it looks to me like for whatever reason they got in the water, very quickly they were feeding in the water. So food resources drive a lot of evolution. And I think what happens in a major driver of evolution is adopting a behavior, and then evolution favors the individuals that do that thing better, right? And so being in the water feeding is tough if you're a terrestrial animal, but the more aquatic you are, the better you can be at that. And so I think feeding was a major driver in this transition from terrestrial to aquatic.
Mhm.
It may have been predator avoidance at first, right? Because those early artiodactyls, the rowellids were omnivorous little guys, right? So there were undoubtedly bigger predators around. And if they could escape into the water, and then they're like, oh, hey, there's food here, right? And then start feeding there. Both of those are really great reasons to be in the water. Um, can't answer it definitively, but that's what we see.
Well, that's what that, yeah. And it's so hard to go back. You can't do the experiment. You can't be there to observe it. So
Mm-mm.
you have to make inferences that seem reasonable based on the morphology of the animal, where you think that animal lived, when that animal lived, what was going on at the time.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
And it's
exactly.
almost always multifactorial. There's not one reason, there's probably several. And the more reasons it's better to be in the water, the more successful that evolutionary transition is going to be.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. That's a really good point. Um, there's another $6 million question, which I suppose we would expect, which is why did they get so brainy? Why did they get so intelligent?
Well, that's a really great question that we answered. And I think that first transition to odontocetes is because of the origin of echolocation, right? So it's a wholly new sensory system. You might say, well, it's just listening, it's just sound. But think about it, they have to integrate that sound into a picture of the world, right? To make any sense of it. And um it makes sense to me that they need to develop new brain pathways to have that new sensory system. So I think that was the initial change in braininess. And then you saw there was another shift, perhaps, or at least dolphins occupy the largest of brain sizes in modern cetaceans, and they're the most social among the odontocetes, right? And so we like to look at ourselves and say, oh, we're very highly social. So maybe that was a factor in either the maintenance or further driving the braininess a little higher than in other odontocetes.
Right. And I think we have the evidence that the neocetes had inner ear bones that indicated that they were starting to be able to hear higher frequency. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The earliest odontocetes have full-on echolocation. There's evidence they can produce the high frequency sounds and perceive the high frequency sounds.
See, that's really important because it's not, as Mark said, this is a sensory perceptual system that's new. It involves a lot of processing. And then, obviously they can take it to other levels of using it in communication. Um, and I think that what's really, and in fact, in 2015, some of my colleagues and I found that there's actually a second auditory cortex in the brain of echolocating dolphins. So we have one auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex, and we knew that they had a primary auditory cortex on the top of their brain, but we determined that the inner ear also has a second track that goes to a second part of the brain. So they have two primary auditory cortices. We have one. Um, and it's clear that, obviously knowing what we know about the cognition of these animals, that they're doing more than just hearing in a fancy way. They're, as Mark said, they have mental representations and then their cognition just exploded. So, yeah, the dolphin brain is much more than just a big radar dish. Um, and echolocation had something to do with it, but social ecology, I suspect also.
Mhm.
And that change in social ecology probably brought with it a lot of drivers of increased intelligence and social complexity. And many of these animals that we know of today are highly cultural beings. So those are all reasons for why, and why then, you know,
Oh, well, I can answer that question. So
yeah.
at the Eocene Oligocene boundary, there's a major climate shift in the world. So what I didn't show you is in the Eocene, Antarctica was connected to South America and Australia. And at the eastern Aleutian boundary, both of those connections are broken, and a circumpolar or circumantarctic current forms then, and immediately we get glaciation of Antarctica and global cooling and a reorganization of ocean currents that basically went from warm and subtropical everywhere to pretty cold at the poles, and this major gradient from the poles to the equator. And that's basically our world today. And so we shifted from this warm, nice place to kind of cold, and whales, other stuff reacted to this too, but the evolution of whales was majorly affected by this, and that is exactly when we get the origin of odontocetes and mysticetes.
Yep. So they responded to this major shift environmentally and in prey availability in a quite dramatic way. Maybe other kinds of species, when they're faced with that, they go extinct. Certainly the archeocetes went out, the new forms came in. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And these are the kinds of things that really drive some big evolutionary changes.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's see, we've got some more. And yes, this presentation is being recorded and it will be shared, so don't worry about that. Let's see, there is well, somebody here asked about brain sizes and the mass or surface area, number of neurons, and the EQ seems irrelevant. Well, in one sense, EQ, encephalization quotient, which is a fancy brain to body ratio, taking into account some things, is not irrelevant, but it doesn't tell the whole story, right? It doesn't. I mean, it's a whole brain to a whole body. And it does tell you something. It tells you that there's a really good reason why that species has a big brain, because nobody has a really big brain that's metabolically expensive unless they have really good reason to have it carrying around. And I think in dolphins and whales, about 20% of the oxygen goes to their brain. And of course, there are many other measures of brain evolution that many people have looked at. And, you know, that we could have a whole other webinar on that. But, you know, I mean, surface area certainly is more extensive in many cetaceans than in humans, but their neocortex is thinner. So how do you put all of those data together and say, aha, you know, and that's very, very difficult to do.
And I will say EQ was developed by paleontologists because it's something we can measure, and all that other stuff we cannot, right? And it is admittedly crude, right? Like we recognize that brain to body size ratio both are estimates. Like the brain size is estimate, body size is estimate, but at least we have some data behind those estimates. And like Lori said, all those other things are really important and really relevant, but not attainable, not accessible in the fossil record. So just give us this one thing, and y'all who work in the modern can look at neurons and connection, you know, complexity and all that. We're just add this one little piece to the story. So
right, and we showed the endocranial cavity. You might, Mark, you might want to just describe a little bit more about when you're a cetacean paleontologist, what do you actually have to work with?
yeah, I mean, for the most part, it's bones and teeth, right? Rarely we get, like I said, soft tissue preservation. And the only soft tissue preservation that I know of in whales is baleen. So we can't even tell you when dorsal fins evolved, because that's a completely soft tissue structure. You know, the tail, the flukes, at least insert on the vertebral columns. The vertebral column has features, as I showed you, that indicate the presence of flukes, but the dorsal fin's just a piece of skin basically sticking up off the back, and so there's no bones and we can't tell you when they were there. Same with brains. Like we don't have the brains, but we have the space that the brain occupied. In most mammals, the brain fills up the endocranial cavity, except there's some vascular structures in there too. We kind of had to subtract out, but we can also look at like nerve tracts. Like for instance, whales basically don't have a sense of smell anymore. Because if you think about it, that's sensing chemicals in the air. Well, they only come up to breathe, and they don't spend much time up there, so it's not a really useful sense. So we can look at the olfactory tract and tell you that basilsaurids had more sense of smell than modern whales, but not much. And right after that, it basically goes away because we can see those nerve paths, and they become tiny and not relevant. And like Lori had me point out, the basilosaurid, or the protocetus skull, has sort of a triangular space for the brain, which is very differently shaped than that of modern whales. That their brain case kind of blows up into a globe, which is why if you look at the back of a dolphin skull, it's kind of a basketball shape or a volleyball shape. Very different. So they not only get bigger, but they change shape too because of the growth of the neocortex and
Exactly.
and others, presumably because they need that brain tissue to do the new things they're doing, like echolocation and sociality.
Exactly. And what parts of the brain get bigger and what parts of the brain get smaller allow you to infer something, not exactly, but something about a little bit about what was important for that animal and what wasn't important anymore. So, but again, as Mark pointed out, you work in the field of paleontology and with brains, the soft tissue, and you're trying to make inferences, you don't have a lot to work with. So you use whatever you can to make intelligent inferences. And you try to bring all those data together.
So there's one from Malcolm here about the flipper, and there's a bit of a misconception. I want to back up. What I said was that humans, like all mammals, have the same bones in their hand, their 4 feet, whatever you want to call these things, right? So forget human, just forget human. Humans we're weird with our opposable thumbs. Like that is a very specialized thing that happens in primates. But back up, the same bones are in, Eocene, even Mesozoic mammals have the same bones in their hands, right? So in humans, we've adapted this digit 1 to be this cool thing we can do stuff with. But no, whales did not have opposable thumbs, and they couldn't do all this kind of stuff. They were artiodactyls, right? And artiodactyls have hooves. Hooves are just the last phalange, and there's this sort of flat, big thing on it. They had 5 digits, all with little hooves on them. So humans are exceptional. Other primates, like other great apes, have opposable thumbs, and other primates do too. But don't think this is a feature of mammals. It's a feature of higher primates, not whales.
There's a question here about why Indo-Pakistan region? Why were there fossils found there? Do we know?
Who knows, right? I mean, right place, right time. It certainly has good preservation potential, right? Because it's a shallow sea. There's the beginnings of mountains shedding sediment, so you need basically water and sediment to preserve the fossils. And obviously these guys lived there, and so when they died, we got their fossils in the sediment. Why they evolved there, who knows? Like, I couldn't even begin. Like, there's this idea that there's an idea, because a lot of modern mammals show up at the beginning of the Eocene. Whales are a little bit behind that, but artiodactyls show up at the beginning of the Eocene, and there's this hypothesis called the Garden of Eden hypothesis, that a lot of modern mammal groups evolved first in India. Remember, India was an island continent that then only was at the beginning of the Eocene starting to touch Asia, and that maybe they came out of India into Asia. So there's not a lot of pre-Eocene fossils in India, which is what we really need to sort of assess that hypothesis. But it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting idea. Oh my gosh, we can go on and on, but we are coming to the close of our webinar, and I want to end with a question from Anne. And this is one that's going to require us to put a lot of thought into, and that is, how is current climate change projected to change the evolution of whales?
Well, I've actually written about this too, not about the future, but about the past. So, whales today, if you look at where their diversity is concentrated, it's in temperate regions. It's really interesting. A lot of, when you look at most diversity on the planet, it's concentrated near the equator. Whales are in mid latitudes. They like it fair to midland, I like to say. And that's not too hot, not too cold. And I did a study with my colleague Felix Marx. We looked at the fossil record and showed that we looked at what factors affected whale diversity over time since they became fully aquatic. What has affected their diversity? And the two factors are temperature and ocean productivity. And so whales like it where it's not too hot, not too cold, and there's a lot of productivity, which means a lot of food. And true, we find whales everywhere, and some are polar and some are tropical, but more diversity at these fair to midland temperatures. So I hate to make predictions, right? Like we don't, this is not our thing. We don't do this a lot, but it could actually be better if the world warms a little bit, right? Because if the polar ice melts, there'd be more water up on the continents, and that tends to drive productivity up. There's those areas, that continental shelf area tends to be very productive. And if it was a little warmer, they might do a little better because the highest peak in productivity of whale diversity was in the mid-Miocene when it was a little warmer. So, maybe, but as long as we don't do other things to hurt whales, which we are, like right whales are probably going to go extinct because of ship strikes, and those happen to be ice margin specialists, right? If there's no polar ice, they won't have a place to feed. So it's going to have varying effects. So like those are probably going to go extinct. Polar bears are probably going to go extinct because there's no sea ice. Others might thrive because they like this more moderate temperature. But the truth is we can't make a prediction, right? We that's one factor among many. And so, for our own self-interest, I think we don't want to do that because most of the humans live in coastal areas that will be flooded by future climate change. And maybe that would be good for whales because there are fewer of us. Maybe they'd have an easier time of it, to be frank.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I mean, that's really, we can't tell. It's all multifactorial. I mean, one of the frightening parts about climate change is we don't know how to predict. And so anything could happen, within reason. And like you said, there's fishing lines, there's boat strikes, we're taking away the food, and all those things have big impact on their ability to live in the oceans.
Noise pollution.
Noise pollution, their ability to communicate with each other, you name it, we're doing it. So we've got to be mindful of that we certainly don't want to continue to be the agents of destruction for the whales, and try to do what we can to protect them. So, Mark, any last statements?
As I said, whale paleontology has really picked up in the past 20, 25 years, and we still got so much more to do. Like there are so many fossils already in museums that just need to be described, and we're still finding more. And so in fact, I know a paper came out today I still haven't looked at. It's really exciting. And I have one I'm reviewing that's even more exciting about a new fossil from Peru. So just keep your eyes out, keep listening. I will say, if you're interested in this, I just filmed a Nova episode that's gonna, I think, broadcast in spring. So keep your eyes out, and we'll have a whole Nova episode on whale evolution for you to enjoy.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait for that. So thank you. And yes, if you're at all interested in anything we've said today, I guarantee you'll have a ball if you go into this field. So Mark, thank you so much. It is an honor and also just a great pleasure to see you. And obviously always to work with you, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us. And we will have a recording up in a few days, and you can feel free to share and let me know if you have additional questions, and you can email me and I'll try to answer them. So
Thank you for having me. This was really a lot of fun. I always love talking to folks, and always great to see you and work with you again.
yes,
We'll do some more.
we sure will. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Be well.
Bye.